Hi, everyone. I know. Uh, my father is telling me not to start speaking. Of course, I wasn't going to start speaking. I was just going to ask everyone to please start sitting and preparing for me to speak. So don't worry, Dad. I've got this under control. Your seat, in fact, is over there. Yeah. Okay. Hmm? Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So I just, I wrote something and I plan on speaking from that after we get the logistics sorted, which is everyone sitting. And I was reminded now, if you could please silence your cell phones, that would be great. Um, and as soon as everyone's sitting, we can start the service. I think we have a lot of people speaking here, so the sooner we get it started, the better. And okay. 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 Hi, everyone. I'm Mom's son, Eli Klein. We're deeply touched that so many of you made it here today. Some walked while others came from around the world. Still more watching a live stream on the Global Justice Center's YouTube. Others will see a recording of the service. We are eternally grateful for the hundreds of heartfelt and profoundly moving tributes received to my mother. Mom lived her life personally and professionally, always aiming to do the right thing, make the correct arguments, with a true dedicated effort to change the world without expecting to be acknowledged for it now. She wanted to make a difference, and she did. You'll hear from speakers today about her professionally, but I want you all to know that even more effort and skill was put into raising my brother David and me in the most loving way. I couldn't even begin to detail the remarkable experiences she gave us, and frankly, it would be too emotional to discuss without simply collapsing. Her brilliance and kind spirit have largely defined who we are today. We will always love, cherish, and preserve her legacy, encouraging others to live by Mom's motto of power, not pity. Mom deserves to be honored and remembered, and we did our best to arrange that. She continued to be sharp and organized until her passing. She would consistently shrug me off at any mention of a memorial service. Multiple times I asked her, and she would just completely shrug me off. She flatly refused a funeral. So we did our best to give her the send-off that she deserves, and have received tremendous assistance from fantastic people. You all know who you are. You may notice in the program we have 18 speakers, but each with a 5-minute limit, which I will do my best to enforce, so we will likely be able to keep this service under 2 hours. I'll be back at the end with a few important closing remarks. And now, my father, Richard Klein, my mom's husband for 32 years, will speak. Thank you.
So at one point, we were thinking of having this function at the Harvard Club, even though Jan and I always regarded that as such a snobby, snooty kind of a place. But it would have been appropriate in a lot of ways, because Harvard really is what changed Jan. She had arrived from a small town in Minnesota to Cambridge, having come out east only once before in her life to meet a boyfriend she was dating while she was at college out in Connecticut. She was choosing between the University of Chicago, which had given her a lot of money to study there, or Harvard. And she wanted to leave the Midwest. She wanted to come to the East. She arrives in Cambridge without any money really to speak of. She went to the student assistant office needing a job, needing a place to live, and she got both of those by living in the house of the dean of the divinity school, taking care of the house and doing some cooking and doing some cleaning as well. Jan and I, we were in the same small section at law school. We started going out in January of our first year. Immediately, and I think it's not an exaggeration to say that it was love at first sight. From the beginning of the time we started going out. I had a job that summer at legal, doing criminal work, and Jan came to New York in the spring to interview for a job where she would work for civil legal services. She interviewed with Toby Golic, who's here, who's going to be speaking in part about that interview. And Jan knew her calling. She knew that working on behalf of poor people, largely minority people, is what she should be doing. She understood immediately the value of that law degree. And whereas so many other people who started at Harvard with us in 1969, who had been committed when they came in to public interest and then got tempted and then got lured away by the money and the easy job we were all to get at these corporate law firms, Jan became increasingly political, and she knew what she wanted to do with her life, to work on behalf of those who really needed her most. We got married, so we spent that summer together in New York. We got married the next March. And then we spent the summer after our second year of law school in Seattle. I was working in the public defender's office. Jan got a job with a constitutional civil rights law firm in Seattle. And as we drove across country that we did, we stopped off at her small town in Minnesota, this town of 5,000 people. And I think it's accurate to say the reception wasn't so amazingly, consistently, across the board wonderful. Here was this woman who now had come back to Detroit Lakes, a committed feminist, an anti-war activist, a radical who was dedicating herself to working for the poor people, and kept her name after we got married even. She remained Benshoof, as of course you know. And to some extent, I got blamed for all of that. And it took a while before her parents and I warmed up to one another, but we all certainly did. So after we graduated law school, Jan went to work for South Brooklyn Legal Services. And the head of South Brooklyn at the time, Chip Gray, is one of the people who's going to be speaking to us today. Jan stayed there for 5 years, and then she found out about a job working for the ACLU doing abortion rights. And again, what abortion rights litigation meant to Jan, and what it indeed was continuing to work for poor people, because wealthy people were always able to get abortions in this country. It was those states that were making regulations and restrictions that was simply so hard for someone to overcome that needed Jan's help. And those were people who, boy, did they get help from this person. She then left the ACLU. She became interested in working more international, and the ACLU limited their work to what's going on in this country, and she started her own reproductive freedom project, the Center for Reproductive Law and Policy. And two people who worked with her, Kitty and Andrea, are going to be speaking about the ACLU and about the Center for Reproductive Law and Policy. When Jan left the center, she wasn't quite sure what she was going to be doing. And she had a friend who was involved with saving the last Jewish temple in Rangoon, trying to keep it running. And Jan went to Burma to try to help that temple, and it was love. Jan just had an immediate connection with the people in Burma. And you're going to hear a couple of them speaking today, these two wonderful women who Jan met, who Jan helped so much, who are thriving here now in this country. And she sure saw the need in Burma to fight against the military dictatorship, which had so denied the human rights of the Burmese citizens. So what led to Jan's success? I think anyone would say that she was a genius and that she was brilliant. But it was certainly more than that. She was so creative. She would think outside the box. If others would say, no, we're never going to do it, Jan would say, there has to be a way. And she would persist. And sometimes even the people she worked with didn't think that pursuing a certain path was going to lead to success. Jan knew it would, and she fought, and so often she managed to accomplish what her goal was. She didn't care about the odds. They weren't going to intimidate her. And Jan was a little bit of a contradiction as a person. She was so forceful in so many ways, but she was also inhibited, just personally. She'd work so hard at that job, and she would love not being on. She'd love just being able to get away from having to do that work. And sometimes some people would interpret that as a kind of arrogance on Jan's part, as a kind of aloofness. But Jan was also very insecure. In spite of everything, she remained someone who was insecure, and that showed itself to people. And again, sometimes in terms of, well, she's accomplished so much, she's not paying any attention to me, she just must be someone who's full of herself. And that simply wasn't it at all. So these last weeks, Jan was diagnosed. Can I just have my bottle of water? Sorry. Jan was diagnosed with cancer on November the 2nd, and she passed on December 18th. Those are 6 weeks, and I think there's certainly some solace that we can take from those weeks. Number one, and perhaps most importantly, she was never in real pain. At no time. She was a fighter in the beginning when it seemed as though there was hope. She was 70 years old, and again, if we read in the newspaper, 70-year-old dies, we don't say to ourselves immediately, oh my God, how young, how could that be? 70 is a good age, and she knew it. And she would say that she had 70 wonderful years where she thrived and she did so much work that was important. But for those of us who saw her so much in those last weeks, we never thought that she was 70 for a second. She looked so young. Her skin was so clear and clean and soft. So even though we knew that she was 70, we'd have to remind ourselves that indeed she was 70. And she was surrounded by love those last weeks. Her incredible husband, Alfred Meyer, who was there all of the time and did so much to make those weeks as good as they could possibly have been. Alfie's sister, Martha Meyer, who flew in from Oregon to spend those last weeks. Alfie's sister, Ann Rothschild, who's going to be talking. Kaythee and Phyu, these two women from Burma, who are also going to be speaking. Olivia, who managed somehow in the midst of all this to be there all the time and to be doing so much of what Jan needed, but to have a spirit about her that made the rest of us feel up and positive about things. And our children. David and Eli, and David's wife, Olga, who celebrated with David their 1-year anniversary of the civil marriage ceremony just yesterday, and Eli's fiancée, Susan, of whom he's going to be speaking about when he closes his remarks, when he closes this with his remarks. They were incredible. Olga was at the hospital taking charge, knew so much, and Susan was just giving all of her love to Jan. And Jan was enveloped and knew it surrounded by this love of these people. And moments stand out in life, and one moment that I will never forget is 2 days or so before Jan died. I was right next to her on the bed, and she would wake up periodically. She didn't speak very much, and we made a fake toast to one another, where I said, how could we be so lucky as to have such wonderful children? And we did. And Jan smiled, and she said, I know. So I've always had a problem with these celebrations, sort of, you mourn the death of someone. How can there be a celebration? Yes, I understand you're celebrating the life of the person and all of that. And there is so much to mourn about Jan, this person who dedicated her life to helping so many people. This person who has to inspire us, and we have to revere her. But boy, is there indeed a lot to celebrate. To celebrate this woman who leaves this small town in Minnesota, who fights for the poor people in Queens, fights for the tenants in Brooklyn, struggles on behalf of women who can't get abortions throughout the country, fights against rape as an instrument of war, and ISIS's attack against the Christian Yazidi girls, fighting against the military control in Burma. When I was leaving one night, the night that Jan died, my sons and I were leaving there at 10:30 and leaving her bedroom, and she died at 11:40 that night. And one of our sons went up to Jan, and Jan at that point, the breathing was slowing down, and it was clear that death was imminent. And he grabbed her hand, and he kissed her cheek, and he said to her, before I say what he said, let me just introduce that by saying that Jan didn't believe in the afterlife. There was no sweet coating of death. I certainly didn't either. Our kids didn't either. It wasn't that, oh, well, now you're going to a better place kind of a thing. Death, we all knew what death meant. But our son went up to Jan, and shocking as this was, kissed her on the cheek, held her hand, and said to her, you've helped so many people in this world, and now you're just going to go to another world where you're going to, again, help so many people who need you so badly. So maybe there is a bit of truth in all of that. Okay, Toby?
Hello, I'm Toby Golic. I was a clinical law professor for over 30 years, and in the course of that, I interviewed probably thousands of law students, and I have to say that I have forgotten almost every single one of those interviews. But there's one interview that I'll never forget, because that's the interview where I encountered Janet for the first time. I was myself 24 years old. I was just out of law school. It was my first legal job, working in Queens Legal Services. And for some reason, they asked me to interview the applicants for summer legal positions. So I agreed to do it, and Janet walked in. Even then, as a young woman, the only word I can think of to really describe her is incandescent. It wasn't just that she was beautiful, which she was and remained so for her whole life, but she radiated a kind of energy that just lit up that shabby office in Sutphin Boulevard in Queens, and that was an energy that was later going to light up the whole world. Janet was so smart. We talked about the problems that my clients who were on public assistance were having, and Janet suggested that there should be a right to life. Not the so-called right to life that she spent her career fighting about which is really the opposite of a right to life, but a right for everybody to have a decent standard of living, a place to live, food, safety. Needless to say, she was hired, and that began what was nearly a 50-year friendship. We got to work together later at South Brooklyn Legal Services with Chip Gray, who will speak after me. Janet's enthusiasm and her joy just infected the whole office. It was a kind of crazy place. We were in housing court. Imagine the court officers going up and down the aisles saying, shut up, this is a court, shut up. Tenants sitting with their boxes of the roaches that they were going to show the judge later to, someone with a rat that was defrosting. Janet had a very special ability to both find these things funny, but at the same time, totally outrageous. I don't know if I was there or just thought I was there because Janet was such a good storyteller that I thought I might have been there. But she had a client who was going to be evicted the following morning, and all of the judges were not in the court, and Janet found a judge she found that they went to this St. George Hotel to go swimming, and she got some judge out of the pool to sign this wet order to show cause to stop the eviction. Janet was brilliant. Richie said she thought outside the box, but she actually thought outside the box that was outside the box. There were some clients in Brooklyn who had been tricked into buying these $1,000 vacuum cleaners as part of a crazy buying club. And, what do? Janet brought an antitrust case. Poverty lawyers don't do antitrust. We don't, we have housing and stuff, but we don't have antitrust law. But Janet had a course in it, and she had the idea of using it, and she did, and the district judge said, that's crazy and ridiculous, and threw the case out. But those of you who know Janet know that she would persist, and she did, and she won the case in the Second Circuit, making important antitrust law. You'll hear a lot about Janet's brilliance today, I'm sure, but she not only had a magnificent brain, she had a tremendous heart. She cared so much about her friends, her beloved sons, David and Eli, the two loves of her life, Richard and then Alfred. She had this wonderful quality of mischief and fun. We broke a lot of laws together. She got me to read books no one ever heard of, which I loved. When she found out I was going to get married, with no fuss and no guests, she somehow tracked down the address of the judge and sent 4 dozen yellow roses. She was always totally romantic. And now, even when something ridiculous happens in my life or in the world, in my imagination, I'm still talking to Janet and sharing it with her and hearing her wonderful and infectious laugh. I am just going to miss her more than any words could say. Thank you.
Toby's already told you quite a bit about Janet at South Brooklyn Legal Services. I'll add a little bit more. But what I really want to focus on throughout this is how much fun it was to work with Janet in legal services. She came in 1972 to South Brooklyn. She was fresh out of law school. She went into housing court, and Toby hinted at it, but this was a horrendous place. Not only physically, but the judges and the landlord's attorneys, all older men, worked by intimidation and abuse more than anything else. There were lots of legal services lawyers who basically couldn't deal with it. It was just too awful. Needless to say, Janet was totally fearless. She was never intimidated. And one of my fond memories of her is overhearing a discussion between her and a landlord's attorney. And essentially, the landlord's attorney could not believe the conversation that was going on. Here was a a young woman, and I think at the time she probably could have been mistaken for a teenager, a young woman, and who is not only a lot smarter than he was, but she was a lot tougher than he was too, and she got what she wanted. And it was a real pleasure just seeing the process in action. Needless to say, she didn't always get her way in housing court. So she had, I think at one time, about 15 appeals she was working on. It wasn't only quality, it was volume if necessary. And in the process of handling those appeals, she helped move New York City landlord and tenant law in the right direction, and still has a way to go. I'm pretty much familiar with Janet's later career on a second-hand basis, but what I've heard reminds me a lot of a kind of a saying that went around legal services in the 70s, which is, if you could be effective in Brooklyn Housing Court, going to handle federal class actions, that was going to be easy. And everything seemed to come easily to Janet, so that was certainly true of her. Not that she stopped with federal court as a boundary of her advocacy. It obviously was worldwide. Janet was particularly fun to work with because, as Toby said, she was incredibly creative. She usually was a step ahead of the rest of us in terms of developing new strategies, but it wasn't an exclusive thing. She brought people along with her, and that's what made her so much fun to work with. In addition, she brought to her work something that was really unusual. She brought a joy. I think Toby used the word, but I don't know what else to say. I mean, there was just this sense of her, a kind of sacredness about the way she related to her job and to other people in that world. She was incredibly generous with that spirit, and that generosity not only helped but inspired everybody who worked with her, and we'll always be grateful.
As director of the American Civil Liberties Union in the 1970s, I had the opportunity to hire Janet and to launch her on her career of defending reproductive rights. At the ACLU, we had been involved in efforts to legalize abortion starting in the middle of the 1960s, and I was one of those who mistakenly thought that when we achieved success in the United States Supreme Court, the main battle was over. Obviously, that proved to be very far from the case, and a little while after the Supreme Court decision, it became clear that we needed to launch a reproductive freedom project to try to secure compliance with the U.S. Supreme Court decision. I consider myself very fortunate to have been able to hire Janet at that moment. I have been asked many times what accomplishments I am proudest of during my tenure at the American Civil Liberties Union. And my response is that I was able to recruit a number of extraordinary people who made significant differences in the areas on which they worked. And one of those who stands high in that is Janet Benshoof. She was one of 3 project directors in that period at the ACLU who was chosen to be a MacArthur so-called genius recipient, and that didn't even include another project director such as Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who directed the Women's Rights Project. Janet, as you have already heard, was joyful. I think of her as a joyful and mirthful warrior. She was very much a warrior as well as somebody who was joyful and mirthful. And she communicated that spirit to the whole organization. When I look at the photograph that is on the screen in front of you, or the photograph that is on the program for this event, they seem to me to capture Janet very well. That's the way I recall her. Always somebody with a smile on her face, always somebody ready to go into battle and enjoying the battle and inspiring others by her enjoyment of it. She was not only influential with those people who worked with her on reproductive rights, but she communicated that spirit throughout the operations of the American Civil Liberties Union. And I benefited immensely from the spirit that she provided to that organization. It's been said that she lived a full life to the age of 70. I think of that as being cut off prematurely. I'm a decade older than Janet was, and I would have thought that she would be around for a long time to come. But even if she is not around, I think the spirit with which she infused the activities in which she engaged will persist for a substantial period to come. And so I do mourn the loss of Janet, but I think it is also appropriate to celebrate Janet. Thank you.
I'm David Klein, my mom's son, Janet's son. In case anyone is wondering, the order was designed really in chronological order of my mom's life. I think hopefully we did a decent job at that, the order of speakers, that is. And I guess first I want to thank you, everybody, for coming here and for being in my mom's life. I think, you know, first of all, my mom did tell me in her last few days that she did want a memorial. So I think we honor her here. And for those who knew her very well, I think you can all agree that my mom would have loved the attention that she's getting today. And I'll also say that, you know, for those who weren't there in the final days, Mom died extremely peacefully and really welcomed. Wasn't scared of death at all. It was really remarkable. I can never imagine anyone like that, but she really wasn't. And it's, I think, in a large part due to all of you in this room and the memories and accomplishments Mom created. She was very, very fulfilled and content and satisfied with her life, from her family to her career, and was really able to pass, really, I'd say, completely peacefully and just not frightened at all of death. So I want to thank you all in this room for all of the time and opportunities and memories that you really helped my mom create. I won't speak really about my mom's career, and I'm going to make this, I think other people have that covered today. But suffice to say, you know, I think I can speak on behalf of my brother and I. You know, we're very grateful to have such a strong leader in women's rights to be our mother. For those who know us, I can't imagine how we would have turned out without such a strong women's rights leader as our mother. And I really mean that. So we're very, very thankful, and I think eternally grateful for at least that kind of balance in our life. I'll also say that I guess I think it's fair to say women are not underrepresented today at this event. And I will just kind of, I'm going to make this very short so I can make a point here that I'd really like to make. And
my point is that, I will always regret for the rest of my life not spending more time with my mom. And my mom would call me, and she'd say she'd want to come over and, organize my stuff. For those who know Mom, she just loves organizing. It was crazy. She'd want to go in my loft, which is kind of like a pit of despair in my house, and just organize it. And she was older, and she'd have to climb stairs. And, I would often say, well, Mom, I'm working, or, I'm too busy, or I can't go to dinner tonight. And there's plenty of times when I could have made the time. And I'll always regret that. And if there's one thing I can do to kind of pay it forward to everyone here, I don't think this is too unique of a situation. I want, everyone to know anything could happen to, people's loved ones, or, people can pass quickly in this life. And, again, I'm making this speech short so that I can convey this one, I think, very meaningful message to spend time now with your loved ones, so that you don't regret it like me. Thank you, everybody. Kathryn.
So, good morning, everyone. I'm Kathryn Kolbert. I work with Janet for a number of years at the ACLU, and helped to create the Center for Reproductive Rights with her. My condolences to Richard and to Eli and David and Alfie. And let me just say that Janet was really proud of you guys. She talked incessantly for many, many years about David and Eli. And so you should know that while you may not have spent as much time with her as you would have wanted, she loved you in an incredibly deep way. Janet and I met when it was in 1985. I was involved in a case called Thornburg versus ACOG in Philadelphia, working at the Women's Law Project, and Rhonda Copeland introduced us. And Janet took a train down to Philadelphia and decided she's going to work with me for the day to prep for that oral argument. And it was an amazing day because, of course, the energy of Janet to sit still for a whole day to talk about how to argue one case was really an amazing event. But 2 years later, when I had left the Women's Law Project, she asked me if I would come up to the ACLU and work with her. Please forgive me if I talk a little bit about case names, but I think for many of us in this room, we kind of mark our milestones in life through cases, and Janet certainly did as well. So I came up to New York to work with her on Kendrick, which was the case about sex education and religious freedom, but within about maybe 2 weeks of my arrival, the Supreme Court decided to take on Webster versus Reproductive Health Services, which at that time was our first really big case where we thought we were going to lose Roe versus Wade. And let me just say that from that second on, we were kind of off to the races in a way that I can't describe to anyone except for those of us who were part of it, many of whom are in this room. I know in this room there's a lot of stories that come to mind when you think about Janet. And most of them make us really laugh. And I can't describe her energy, but you're going to hear today from a whole lot of people about the stories of her bigger cases, her getting arrested in Guam, her fighting for the legalization of RU-46 at Kennedy Airport, about her Supreme Court arguments, all of those things. But most of what I think about during that time is just, it was fun to work together. We had a good time kind of changing the world. And to me, Janet was all about the special place in her heart that she took around young people and around doctors who she really worked hard for from the bottom of her heart. But let me just add one extra thing, and that is that Janet was ambitious, kind of in the best sense of the word. Janet dreamed really, really, really big. She believed that we could change the world, make it fairer, more just, imbued with dignity, respect for each other. I look around this room today and see so many people who, after working with Janet, really understood that whatever they did in their careers would mean they could change the world. She instilled that in us, that we could, and frankly, that we must. I worked closely with Janet for 10 years. We did all kinds of things, fighting for medical abortion, fighting for against hundreds of state laws. But those years, I have to say, I think for her and all of us, were a very high point in her legal career. And we created the Center for Reproductive Rights, which today has 170 lawyers working for reproductive justice all over the world, which is an extraordinary legacy that she was at the start of. Let me just say one other thing. I want to thank her for teaching us that with persistence and with courage and with creativity, we could take on anyone, anywhere. I grew up in Detroit and was particularly enamored when Elvis Presley said that ambition is a dream with a V8 engine. Janet's dream didn't have a V8 engine driving it, but she had a social movement driving it. And she helped become a significant part of that social movement that made her dreams reality for so many women across the world. And I want to urge all of us to continue to make her legacy, that dream, a reality forever in all of our pursuits, and continue to work for that in her honor. Thank you. Andrea.
Good morning. I'm truly honored to be here. You know, as they say, you never forget your first. And Janet was a first in so many ways for so many of us, a true trailblazer. And for me, Janet was a matter of first impression. I was fresh out of college. I was hired as a legal secretary at the ACLU Reproductive Freedom Project, where Janet, as you heard, was the director. I was not assigned to Janet directly, but my vantage point, which involved sitting a mere 10 feet from her office door, meant that I got to see Janet in action and in motion almost every single day at a time when abortion rights were under unprecedented attack, perhaps close to what they are today, again, sadly. So for 18 months or so, I had a front row seat to the creativity, to the brilliance, to the passion, to the drive, to those, oh my gods, that would come out of her mouth so often. But what struck me always was the absolute conviction and the resolute commitment to do whatever it took, and then some, to safeguard women's reproductive freedoms, particularly for those who are most vulnerable. She was, to put it mildly, like nothing and no one I had ever seen or have seen since. Now, it's possible that the fact that Janet and my mom grew up about 45 miles away from each other in northwestern Minnesota and were at the University of Minnesota together at the same time, they didn't know each other, that was probably bound to deepen the imprint that Janet has made on me. But it was her willingness in 1992 to give Kitty the green light, first, to bring me into an inner circle, an unbelievable inner circle for a 24-year-old kid who had been a legal secretary, was a legal secretary, to help put together the pieces to launch what was then the Center for Reproductive Law and Policy, and then to trust me at that age to create and run its communications and public affairs department. That forever changed my life, and for which I will forever be in Janet's debt. I'll never forget how Janet made the case for why we needed a new organization. This may sound familiar to some of you. She'd say, you know, there are more groups solely dedicated to saving the spotted owl around the world than to saving women's reproductive rights. Now, I can't tell you how many spotted owl dedicated organizations there were. I actually never looked it up. if any existed at the time. But for women, the answer until CRLP was 0. And honestly, whether Janet had that specific fact right or not was really not the point. Because what Janet always got right was the deeper truth, the profound reality that for far too long women have suffered from injustice and inequality simply because we can have babies. Her uncanny ability, her incredible gift to get to the heart of the matter was always on full display. And I think my other favorite example of that was in the spring of 1991 when Utah joined a growing handful of states and a territory to ban abortion outright. And Janet was undaunted, and she said, we're putting a full-page ad in the New York Times. And it declared, in Utah, they know how to punish a woman who has an abortion. Shoot her. Now, in this case, she was factually right, because in their haste, Utah had made abortion a capital crime, and the punishment for a capital offense at the time was firing squad. But again, the facts are really not the point. The deeper truth, the profound reality, was that these lawmakers were driven by an utter disdain and an extreme disregard for women's lives and health, and that was always the core of what Janet made sure we all knew and we were fighting against. The 5 years I spent at the center were nothing short of extraordinary. Her leadership, her determination to never give up, never take no for an answer, the team of feisty lawyers she assembled to get the work done, she brought out our best thinking, our greatest impact. I truly don't think I could imagine having started my career with that. I could never have asked for a better starting point. If I make my way in the world now, even running an organization, I often find myself thinking, WWJD, what would Janet do? And I can only hope when it comes time to look back on my life and my career, I'll have done my tiny little part to carry forward her enormous legacy. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Anita Arriola. On March 8, 1990, the Guam legislature unanimously passed a bill which essentially banned all abortions and was the most restrictive anti-abortion legislation to pass in any state or territory since Roe v. Wade established the right to abortion. The bill also prohibited anyone from encouraging, soliciting, or procuring others to have an abortion. Just prior to the legislative debate on the bill, the Archbishop in Guam threatened to excommunicate any Catholic member of the legislature who voted against the bill. The Guam bill set off a firestorm of controversy in and out of Guam. The governor of Guam had 10 days to veto or sign the bill. I knew that I needed to do something, but I needed help. Not just legal help, but moral support, because the author of the anti-abortion bill was my mother, who was a Guam senator at the time. I called my friends at the ACLU in San Francisco, and they referred me to the ACLU Reproductive Freedom Project. Janet took my call, and within a few hours, she agreed to come to Guam to urge the governor to veto the bill. About 24 hours later, the amount of time it takes to fly from New York to Guam, I met Janet for the first time, and she fell into my arms, grabbed me, and said, "My God, where am I? I feel like I've been flying forever." As soon as she touched down on Guam, we went into action, meeting and asking people to lobby the governor to veto the bill. Within days, the Guam Nurses Association, the Guam Society of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, Guamanians United for Self-Determination, People for Choice, and other groups formed on Guam to oppose the bill. Despite our efforts, the governor eventually signed the bill into law. The next day, Janet spoke at a Guam Press Club luncheon, publicly encouraging women in Guam who were seeking abortions where to go in Hawaii to have them. Janet was taken into custody, and I represented her at her arraignment on criminal charges of encouraging and soliciting others to have an abortion. The criminal case was dismissed because soon after, we filed a class action lawsuit, obtained a restraining order, and then a permanent injunction barring the law from taking effect. There was one point when, after spending all-nighters in my office, Janet went missing. We looked everywhere for her, but we couldn't find her. I went into my office, and there, curled tightly into a ball and fast asleep, was Janet on the floor under my desk. At long last, jet lag and sleep deprivation had caught up with her. Janet became my lifelong friend. For the next 20-some years, we tried to meet as often as we could. Maya Angelou said, "I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel." I truly loved being with Janet. I loved her mind, I loved her heart, I loved her spirit. Everywhere we traveled, she avoided the popular tourist sites. She usually wanted to explore hidden, out-of-the-way places. Once we drove miles out of the way to see a temple in Uluwatu in Bali. And even though I've traveled to Hawaii many times, we snorkeled for an hour to reach a bird sanctuary island off Oahu that I'd never heard of. And we hiked for miles, looking for a little-known secluded waterfall in Ponape. Just when we thought we were lost, we ran into some Ponapean children who didn't speak English. I want you to try to imagine Janet pantomiming a waterfall and asking for directions. Waterfall? Whoosh, whoosh. Swim? She was hilarious. She was wonderful. She was a true and loyal friend. In the past several years, we did not see each other as much, but we had a tradition of sending each other small gifts from our travels. A necklace, a scarf, a candle, a book. They were our way of saying to each other, "I miss you. I'm thinking of you." Our friend Carlotta Leon Guerrero, also from Guam, is here. The three of us started our journey in Guam many years ago, and we thought it only fitting to come here to say goodbye. Janet, my dear friend, adios. Este kio mali'i tatlo, until we meet again. Thank you.
My name is Monica Roa. I met Janet in August of 2000 when I arrived from Colombia as a visiting attorney at the Center for Reproductive Rights, back then the Center for Reproductive Law and Policy. That place she created changed my life. Excellent professionals who were continually testing new ideas surrounded me. Many of them became my lifelong friends. Joyful babies, members of our in-house nursery, were being pushed through the hallways on a mail cart. It was a happy time for all of us because we had a shared sense of purpose. We were working to make the world a better place for women. And there was Janet, leading with her unique wit, brilliance, and fearlessness. I was assigned the office next to her. I was very lucky. I shared her views of the Brooklyn Bridge, and I got to meet her. Our mutual drop-ins into each other's office soon turned into a complicit friendship. Around that time, she told me the most important lesson of my life, that I could change the world. She was a mentor to many women that passed through the center. She gave them the confidence and push they needed to build a career in the field of women's rights and social justice. When Janet passed away, I witnessed how social networks exploded with messages of all these women who were sharing their favorite Janet story and expressing their gratitude. Reading all those beautifully written words, I understood that I had also benefited from Janet's mentorship, but that my sadness accounted for so much more. Yes, it was at Janet's house in Woodstock that I had the idea to challenge the complete ban on abortion in Colombia at the Constitutional Court using international law. She helped me fundraise to get the project started and introduced me to the fantastic woman with whom I partnered to do the work. She participated in the conspiratory meetings. She came to hold me up when the court dismissed my case. And she was the first person I called when we finally won on May 10th of 2006. It was her birthday. When I told her on the phone that we had won, she cried, and she said to me that her beloved Susie Buffett, who had given us her support and had died earlier that year, would always be with her on her every birthday. I sincerely hope Susie and Janet will join me celebrating the anniversary of the recognition of Colombians' women's reproductive rights every May 10th to come. She also knew this line of work involved high risks and was there for me when I had to leave the country for security reasons 5 years ago and move to Spain. But again, Janet was much more to me than a mentor. I had the luxury of experiencing Janet in both the brilliant and mundane, where genius met motherly love, where my rock star became a groupie, when her passion for international law encountered wine and home-cooked meals, where trips turned into memorable episodes. She became my home away from home, my friend, my sister, my mother, my daughter, my teacher, my student. That is how she signed her emails to me. Dear Janet, my queen of Scandalia, you will always knew how to make an entrance. Now I know you can also gratefully depart. You lived upholding the principles of choice, autonomy, and dignity, and passed away honoring them as well. I pledge to continue celebrating your memory by dedicating my life to pursuing rights, justice, and equality, cherishing the sisterhood that you created, and mentoring young women to carry this movement forward for generations to come. Thank you for giving me the most precious gift, a place in your life. I know I will always find you in my heart, right outside the box, wearing your Chie Mihara shoes.
Good morning. The word eclectic. Before I met Janet, I had never heard of that word before. And the first time she said it to me, because this was before cell phones, I ran home and I looked it up on the dictionary, in the dictionary. And I think this morning, well, when I did look at the dictionary, I got an idea what she meant, but I think this morning, more than looking at the dictionary, I realize what she means. Good morning, my name is Katie. Janet liked to introduce me as her Burmese daughter, and initially when she did start doing that, it was a little uncomfortable because, also I have, weird mother situation issues, and when she started saying that, I was like, I don't know, I kind of prefer you as a friend, but you know what, I'm good. I met Janet in the early 2000s in Burma, and I was working as a photojournalist then for an aid agency and doing semi-legal civil society building stuff. And one day, the US cultural attaché calls me, whom I knew professionally and socially, that he said, I want you to come to lunch at my house. You have to meet somebody. And I wasn't too thrilled because he's vegan and he likes to serve half-cooked eggplant. So I said, okay, fine, well, sure, Ron, I'll be there. So then I show up, and then I meet this woman. She walks in, and she says, "Hi, my name is Janet, and I'm going to be your auntie." Panic, and I'm like, okay. But, during the course of lunch, she finds out that I was trying to go to college in the United States, and she says, tomorrow morning, come to my hotel room, bring everything you got, your college application stuff. And so I do, and she reads it all, and she goes, "Oh, honey, this isn't gonna do. You're so honest and earnest, like that's not how you get into college." I said, "Really?" So for the next month, she decides she's gonna stay in Rangoon and help me and get into college. And every evening after work, I go straight to a hotel and write my application essays, which I'd work on it, and she'd read it. She'd be like, "Okay, redo this." So like I wrote a new thing or like edited for like 30 straight days, and after the month was over, she's like, "Okay, we've got something we can work on." You mean we're not done yet? So yeah, that's how so during the course of the month, we became close friends. We realized that we really had a lot in common and enjoyed being around each other, to the point where later on in life, it was like we'd be sitting on the same couch, not saying anything, and still enjoying each other's company. And that was a great thing. Also, a lot of us who knew Janet knows that she was into episodes. And I had many fun, and now looking back, poignant episodes. Like that one time, she calls me in my dorm room. This is before cell phones. "Hey, I'm on the thruway. I'm like 10 minutes away. Get ready. We're gonna do pizza and fries." And I was like, "Yeah." So then I get into the car, and then she keeps driving into the boonies, or we're getting closer to the mountains. This is in upstate New York, and I'm thinking, what kind of pizza places could it possibly be? And then it turns out she was taking me for skiing lessons. It turns out, and I said, "Well, where's the pizza and fries?" She says, "No, that's the ski technique. We're doing pizza and fries." Or that time when she gifted me a bunch of Brooks Brothers skirts that she got at a really great price because she never paid retail. And this is, I'm in college, and I do some like my own seamstressing. So like I cut them really short till the day, till even very recently, she will not let me forget that I cut up all those expensive skirts into like micro minis, and it was like, she never forgave me, and she let me remember it every time. But really, we were the same kind of people, and in the end, she was right, as usual. She was my mother, in so many words of the way. Thank you.
I'm truly honored to speak at the memorial of the most important person of my life. I first met Janet in 2002 in Rangoon to have her reproductive right research and her legal history of Burma. I took her to the library. I remember so well. This is a historical research library of the Rangoon University. And over there, all the books are locked up in a glass door cabinet. And we were not allowed to access them. And because we don't have any authorized letter from the government. And then Janice was so upset. And she just like, I have never seen because I'm a very always scary fear in front of the authority. And I just like, no, I have never seen in my life, in the library are not accessible to the people. That's known. And then one of the professors later on helped us to get us some sources. At the time, Burma, and the books are banned, all the medias are banned, even the possessions of banned books, movies, even the foreign currencies, was punishable up to 10 years in prison. So in her very well-known, she called it Burma Diary, she wrote that. Burma was a manifestation of totalitarian terror and the Orwellian nightmare. These experiences were the driving force behind the establishment of the Global Justice Center in 2005. She once said, I have a lot of Janet's quotes, I love. My vow to always speak up against evil has segued into using law as a tool for justice. The Global Justice Center fulfilled this vow, to fight against evil, like the Saddam regime in Iraq and military regime in Burma. I met Janet again unexpectedly in 2005 on the way to DC for my internship for my grad degree here. And right then she said to me, don't go, stay here, walk with us. So I did. And now it's mostly 30 years. I work at the site of Global Justice Center. It was a great privilege to have worked with, laugh with, fun with, travel with, live with, even until her last hour as a part of the family. She was my professional and personal mentor, giving me strength and courage. She empowered me and transformed me into who I am today. I owe her biggest step for her tremendous and tireless work for the voiceless and helpless people of my country people. Her expertise on Burma was deep, very insightful. She did pioneering call for the criminal accountability for the atrocity crimes committed by the ruling military. Janice also called judges as war criminals, since the judges in Burma held all the fake trials against the political opponents of the regime. We were able to smuggling out more than 200 trials transcripts as evidence of these criminal acts. Jenna was the first to analyze this very new 2008 Constitution, and then she is the one, she's followed even the drafting process, and then she argued it breaches international law by placing the military outside of the civilian oversight, even our planned trips. This is a long time plan. Janice really wanted to visit Burma this last December, from December 3rd to December 20th, with Alfred and not me. Sadly, it didn't happen. And Janice was hoping to meet with these lawmakers to strategize the Constitution Amendment, even though this is a vacation trip. Her effort had a huge, huge impact on the improving the lives of people of Burma. She always had a place in her heart for Burma. Her house are always open for the friends of Burma. I received many, many emails and friends expressing their gratitude to her. There are so many moving and touching emails. Personally, I also owe so much her a huge debt of gratitude for taking care of me and my family. I would like to read an excerpt from my daughter's tributes to Janet. It would be an underestimate to say that without Auntie Janet, I would not be who I am today. It was her that pulled me and my brother out from under dangerous oppressed regimes 10 years ago to reunite with long-lost mother. From Burma, I arrived in a foreign country without knowing a language, but from the works of Park Spark to George Orwell, Auntie Janet's endless gifts of books and literature opened up my mind to a world of English and the world around me. Auntie Janet showed a gentle compassion that gave warmth to a family and a cold foreign land. The life I have right now and the high quality education I have received in America would not have been possible without Auntie Janet and her unconditional care and love, which my family and I will remember for the rest of our life. If I can accomplish even half of what my beloved Auntie Janet did, and become a great leader, advocating for the rights of those without any, then I will be able to pay back the gratitude I owe to her and then pass it forward. My family and I determined to pass on her value, her vision. A few days before she passed, I told Janet that I would like to provide a scholarship under her name to ethnic women students at the Federal Law Academy in the Kachin State of Burma, where she taught last year. She was very weak at the time. Next morning, David sent me a message. Phyu, Mama was very happy about the scholarship. That was part of our commitment, a little tiny commitment to continue her legacy. We will all miss her terribly. She will never be gone. Her spirit will always be with us. Rest in power, Janet.
Hi, I'm Oliva Kraus. I got to know Janet when I was an employee at the Global Justice Center. I think one of the things that you can feel today is that Janet was an amazing collector of people. She spent her life assembling this outrageous cast of characters, and I think it's been one of the greatest privileges of my life to have been part of the Janet Benshoof traveling circus of justice, Maltese, and design. But one of the amazing things about being with her is that Janet loved hard. To those of us who were close with her, you were constantly receiving admiration and adoration and extreme generosity. When Phyu-Phyu's family came to America, I got a phone call from Janet being like, Phyu-Phyu's family's gonna be here in 3 days, we're redoing her apartment. I was like, okay. And I remember I was sworn into the bar, I went directly to this apartment in Queens. Janet opens the door, she said, oh good, you're here, take off your suit and put on a shower cap. And apparently we were scraping paint off a ceiling. Like, that was Janet. It was anything. It was renovating a bathroom. It was international law at the highest level. When I broke my arm, she showed up right away with a huge bag of clothing. She's like, you're gonna need clothes for court that fit on your cast. And I was like, yes, I will. Thank you, Janet. One of her amazing attributes was that for someone who was such a genius and so smart, she never made anyone feel small. We were all geniuses when we were around her, and anytime I saw her, I'd get to hear about how Nick was the #1 hockey champion in all of New York City, and you know, how Alfred was good at absolutely everything, and surely he would want to teach me. Just let him know. Even when she was most sick and she was in the hospital, I would arrive at the hospital and she would tell me, Olga's a genius, she found watermelon juice. The tiniest things, she just gave so much credit to people over and over and made us feel like we had just like discovered, you know, a new physics formula. I think she would say that my greatest achievement was when I had the brilliant idea of emptying the refrigerators of the hotel rooms of Iraqi judges because we didn't want them to get drunk. She really thought that was just like my greatest accomplishment. Janet built us all up. She filled us with her confidence in us. She believed in our strengths even when we didn't believe in them. She made us into the people that she saw. It's impossible to properly say goodbye to Janet. I'm just so incredibly grateful to have been part of her cast of characters and misfits. It's been a great privilege.
My name is Bob Bason. I'm Janet's cousin and friend. Janet actually renamed me. She always called me Bob Benshoof Bason, which was not my name. My mother was a Benshoof. And when I got mad at her, as we often did, 2 Benshoofs, for heaven's sakes. I called her Janet Lee, and she always sat up a little straighter, but always won the argument. Lots of people have talked about Janet's brilliance and her perseverance and her legacy and her genius, but I just want to talk about her. As my cousin and as my friend. Janet grew up in a little town with Detroit Lakes, Minnesota. I grew up about 200 miles south of that in Des Moines. We had a common great-grandfather who had been in the Civil War, I was pleased to point out to her, on the right side. But we didn't know each other growing up and never met. And it was only in 1993 when I went to New York to become the vice president for National Planned Parenthood that I became aware that there was a famous Benshoof lawyer somewhere in New York. And because I was interested in genealogy, in fact, I named myself the family genealogist, I wanted to find out who this famous Benshoof lawyer was. And I piqued my interest when those were the bad days when they were shooting our doctors and burning down our clinics in Planned Parenthood. And I found out that we would always go to a woman by the name of Janet Benshoof over at the Center for Reproductive Rights, and that she would go out and kick their butts. And I just said, that's the woman, I want to meet this woman. So I sent her an email. First I wrote a letter, actually I sent an email over to the Center for Reproductive Rights, and I didn't get any answer at all. So I sent a letter over to the Center for Reproduction, introduced myself, said we were cousins, and I didn't hear back. Kept up for a long time. Years later, Janet told me she thought I was some kind of a freak and that I was chasing her, and she wanted to have nothing to do with me because I was a stalker. Ultimately, of course, we met, and our friendship of 24 years began and lengthened and deepened. She invited me to their home. Richard, you wouldn't remember, and the kids wouldn't remember. You were little tiny guys. I see you've enjoyed food more now than you did that night. But that began our friendship. We had a lot of emails, a lot of letters went back and forth between Planned Parenthood and the Center for Reproductive Rights, none of which had anything to do with business. All were filled with Benshoof gossip and funny stories about both of us working in civil rights and in reproductive rights together. So when I left Planned Parenthood about 3 years later, went back to California, our friendship didn't stop, but our conversation waned, obviously. But one day I got a letter from a Benshoof cousin saying there was going to be a Benshoof picnic in southern Minnesota and inviting me to come. This picnic had been going on for 70 years. I had gone as a little boy. My parents had often gone. I decided, for heaven's sakes, I'm going to go. See all these Benshoof relatives. So I picked up the phone and called Janet and said, Janet, I'm going to Minnesota to the Benshoof picnic. I think you should come. I'll pick you up at the Minneapolis airport. We all spend 3 days together, and you can get on the plane and go on back home. And by golly, she said, I'm coming. I think she said, I'm coming, dear. She called me dear from time to time, which I thought was sexually inappropriate, but she did. We spent 3 days together on that trip, and it was an amazing time. I don't think you've ever seen two people talk faster or longer than the two of us did. It was not a particularly good time in Janet's life. She was single. She had just left the Center for Reproductive Rights, started the Global Justice Center, and things weren't going all that well. So we commiserated, we talked, we groaned, we moaned, she cried. But when we got to the farm, I saw a side of Janet that I absolutely became to love, and I think many of you have already experienced it as well. She was very gracious to everybody, of course, and they all liked her, but the people who liked her were the little girls in the Benshoof family, and she absolutely gathered all these little girls around her. She was blonde, she was beautiful, she was gorgeously dressed, she was a famous New York lawyer, and these were little farm girls in southern Minnesota. But the littlest of the girls would not leave her side, sat on her lap, attached herself to her, and the conversation turned to dolls. And this little girl said that she always wanted, I think this is right, is there such a thing as an American Beauty doll? American what? American Girl? She wanted, it was an American Beauty doll. It wasn't an American Girl. Maybe it was an American Girl doll, who cares? She wanted an American Girl Beauty doll. but she couldn't afford it. For the rest of the 3 days, Janet would not stop talking about the fact that this little Benshoof girl, one of her relatives, couldn't afford a American Beauty girl. Needless to say, once Janet was back in New York City, immediately off to some little Benshoof girl in southern Minnesota went an American Beauty doll. It was Janet at her best. Not long after this, I received a call from the then chairman of the board of the Global Justice Center asking if I would consider joining the board. I did. Spent 7 years with them, still on the board actually. Spent 4 years as chairman of the board of the Global Justice Center. Got to go to London with Janet as we tried to importune all of the lawmakers in the parliament to accept the fact that women raped in war were covered by the Geneva Conventions, which was one of her outlandish ideas, which was considered crazy and unacceptable, and eventually now has been accepted by the entire European Union. And about, Alfie, was it 7 years ago, I got a phone call, and Janet, in her inimitable way, and with this funny little girlish giggle that she could do every once in a while, told me that she was in love and she was getting married, and I had to come to New York because I was a Benshoof and I could walk her down the aisle, or if I couldn't do that, I could at least walk Ruth Bader Ginsburg down the aisle. Well, I went, and I got a chance to ask Ruth Bader Ginsburg all about her friendship with, no, that's not true. She didn't say a word to me. She said hello, and I said hello, and that was it. Good years followed. The Global Justice Center grew, the finances stabilized, the work flourished. And then, so suddenly she was ill. The phone call to California, quick trip to New York, the dinner with Alfie and Janet and Luann, her loved sister. I'd already gone out the door, headed back to the hotel when Alfie came and called me back. Janet wanted to give me a last kiss. Janet has touched many lives, including mine, including yours, and including, I think, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of little girls, not only in southern Minnesota, but around the world, whose lives will forever be changed because of one brilliant lawyer from Minnesota. Janet left us a remarkable gift. That brilliant mind has been stilled, but the work goes on. In her will, Janet said this as her last gift. It's to you, and it's to me. And to all my friends, loved ones, these are her words, supporters, clients, colleagues, students, grantors, donors, and other persons who admire and respect my legal work on behalf of women and human rights, I leave you the Global Justice Center in the hope that it will live and flourish as a vibrant, influential human rights organization, and that my vision of justice will live forever.
I'm very honored to be speaking here today. I respected Janet and surprisingly knew she respected me the way she respected thousands of women and men around the world. She'd want them all standing up speaking here, and a lot of us are. It was amazing how she could see and believe in our unique capabilities. She also had an uncanny knack for understanding what was needed. Whether it was in Congo or Burma, Guam, Colombia, South Sudan, Iraq, or in New York City, whether it was giving me time and support when I needed it, or whether she was enabling a woman in Congo to have access to an abortion. She perceived those needs before we even knew what they were. And then she went about finding ingenious ways of helping meet those needs. Her impact was enormous. I met her about 10 years ago, and perhaps following her example, I met one of her needs by introducing her to my brother Alfred. It was one of the better moves I've ever made. She needed someone at her side, and my brother admired and loved her so much that he fit very well there. Alfred and Janet were so happy and very much in love, and she became my sister-in-law and started signing all her emails SIL. The marriage was very inspiring to me. And I learned even more from her, mostly by her example, but also from her insight. And then, even as she was dying, she was remarkable. She died as she lived with clarity and choice. She spent her last weeks organizing many of us to do better, to take care of each other, to be stronger and share our strength. She had a list of things she wanted accomplished. When it was my turn, she called me to her hospital bed and sat me down, and she told me I had to take care of my younger brother, Tom. I was just dumbfounded by her vision and that she could see that needed to be done, and on her deathbed that she was thinking of another wrong that had to be righted. And I've started doing what she told me to do, and already the rewards have been enormous. Stephanie Allen wrote a poem called Leave Takings, and it instructed us to fill the empty place they left, not with more grief, old beliefs, or sorrow, but an opportunity to do their good and our good today, not tomorrow. That's what Janet would have wanted from us. Thank you.
I first met Janet in 2010. She was 62 and I was 27. I, of course, knew of her, and even as I prepared to work with her, I didn't fully comprehend the ways in which she'd already impacted my life. Like the time I needed emergency contraception in college, or the time I was able to get a safe abortion, an abortion that allowed me to move across the country and work for an organization called the Global Justice Center. I had the immense honor of working side by side with Janet nearly every day for the past 8 years. For someone with such an amazingly large vocabulary, I'm not sure she really knew the meaning of the words vacation or weekend. Most days, I was just awed that someone as smart as her would even entertain my presence or my ideas. She brought me into her extraordinary vision for how to create a more equal and just world for women. One where women have equal access to justice, parity in power, and perhaps most importantly, one where reproductive autonomy and gender equality are inextricably linked. It wasn't just her vision of what the world should look like. It was how she went about getting there, which so many people have talked about today, uncompromisingly, with the conviction that the path of least resistance is rarely the right answer, no matter how difficult the other path might be. That nothing is truly a loss, but rather an opportunity to leave no stone unturned, think bigger and more creatively. And perhaps most importantly, that we must always demand what is just and right and not just what is possible. Her ideas, her intellect, her strategies only scratched the surface of who she was to so many people. And this is where we get to the most extraordinary part of who she was. Janet didn't just aim for successes or wins in her lifetime. Instead, her vision was so big that, as she often said to me, she would never see the end result of what she began. This, to me, is why perhaps her most important contribution to the world is maybe not her genius, but rather the cadre of fierce feminists she personally mentored, inspired, and fostered. I should know I had the privilege of being one of them. I met Janet at a time in her life when she had already achieved more than most people could aim to achieve in 4 lifetimes. She very easily could have just been a boss. Instead, she chose to invest in me. She taught me, counseled me, challenged me, and when I needed it, she was just there for me. No matter how much I exhausted her, exasperated her, challenged her right back, she always made the time for me and never lost her unwavering faith in us. Over the past month, I've spent a lot of time reflecting over our time together and the extraordinary connection we had, likely a potent combination of a mutual and equal passion for women's rights and high-heeled shoes. And one memory sticks out. In September 2010, not even 9 months after I started working with Janet, I went on my first international trip with her. We went to the UK and Norway to rally against the Helms Amendment and for women's equal rights to abortion under the Geneva Conventions. My mom, who was instrumental in supporting me working at the Global Justice Center, had sent me some money in anticipation of this trip to buy a new suit and shoes. On that trip, one of our key meetings was a briefing in the House of Lords. And right as we were going in, Janet made me stop and insisted on taking a photo of me and asked for my mom's email address. I, of course, tried to pray it off nonchalantly. Like, it was no big deal. It was just a normal day. It was just the House of Lords. But Janet persisted. And as many of you know, once she made up her mind, there was no other option. The other day, as this memory came back to me, I searched for and found the note Janet sent my mom. And this is what she wrote. Dear Mahana, Akila's a terrific lawyer. See her great new 4-inch heels and gray and blue suit as she's entering security for the House of Lords. Who would have thought? A proud boss to a mother who should be super proud. Best and thank you for her, Janet. Janet was so incredibly giving of herself, in particular to young women. A meeting at the House of Lords was barely significant to her, but even so, she took the time to recognize what an experience like that might mean to a young lawyer like me. So the fact that she took the time to bolster me in that moment, instill confidence and show her faith was something that she did for me and for my mom and not for herself. And I know this was not a singular experience, as we've heard from so many people here today. I've met some of my best friends through Janet, people who have been similarly drawn in by her vision of equality in the world and equally supported, mentored, and fostered by her. In one of my last moments with Janet, I held my cell phone up to her on speakerphone as she spoke for the last time with Justice Ginsburg. And I remember thinking in that moment that Janet was my Ruth, even though I never actually said those words to her. She was the mentor who inspired me, who helped me become a better lawyer, advocate, strategic thinker, feminist, and a better and more compassionate person. She changed my life in immeasurable ways. The world feels like a scarier place without Janet in it, but I'm so incredibly grateful for having had her in my life, because she gave me the tools to help navigate not only today, but also tomorrow. And with this, I know that we are never really without Janet in this world. I miss her immensely, but look forward to, like so many others here, carrying her legacy and vision of justice forward. And I'm now honored to present a video of the remarks of Andrew Solomon, who had to be in California today to honor a longstanding commitment. Andrew was an extremely dear friend of Janet's, a committed activist for LGBT rights, a professor of clinical psychology at Columbia Medical School, and a highly acclaimed best-selling author who has received the National Book Award for Nonfiction, amongst countless other honors and recognitions.
I met Janet because we were companions in depression. She was depressed, and I was depressed, and though that mostly felt like bad news, it was a point of bonding for us. Much depression comes randomly from chemical storms that rage inside the brain, but can also come from and be attached to personal pain. Janet's was both. It was one of her liabilities to have very little boundary between her own sorrows and the anguish of the world. She saw injustice at every turn and it kept her up at night. The muting of the voices of the disenfranchised, the closing down of people's right to self-determination, the lack of control that comes with poverty, the helplessness of those caught in war. Sometimes people fight depression by avoiding all the topics that make them depressed, by trying to bury themselves in music and laughter. But Janet's depression never took her away from the things that made her depressed. It inspired her to look more deeply at them. She was a wonderful friend at all times, but extraordinary if you were in need or overwhelmed, if you were sick or even dying. She plunged most deeply into the Holocaust as the apogee of evil, of people's capacity to damage one another. She wanted to understand where such evil came from, to figure out how we remain human when human beings can do this to one another. She was drawn to horror, but also to dignity, to how people negotiated horror. She found the beautiful heart of courage in the most terrible stories of all. She kept herself always available for the people she loved. While she was trying to restore justice to Myanmar, while she was battling for women's access to reproductive choice, while she was insisting on the recognition of rape as a weapon of war, while she was training judges in Iraq, while she was fighting to break the glass ceiling of patriarchy, she was also always ready to come over if you were struggling. Some people deal with the collective grief of the world as a means to shut out individual stories of suffering. But Janet never prioritized one over the other. She cared for individuals as much as she cared for humanity. She ran the Global Justice Center, but she also ran 1,000 personal justice centers, her connection to her many friends and their rights, always as strong as her commitment to building a more sane society. She had a gift for laughter, the extravagant statement given slapstick and slapdash. She made an art of exaggeration. She could be melodramatic, appearing as the silenced woman in her fundraising letters, even though no one was less silenced than she. I remember her comment on U.S. restrictions that forbid funding for organizations that present abortion as a valid choice for women raped in war. How the U.S. comes in looking like a savior, then fails the most desperate victims. It's like discovering that Santa Claus is a pedophile, Janet said to me. How can we be best friends if we never see each other? She would ask every time we did see each other. But of course, when we tried to see each other more, she was engaged in good works in Iraq or Syria or Myanmar or Beirut. She was brilliant, of course, but had a generosity that doesn't always accompany brilliance. Though she thought well of herself, she put the needs of others almost obsessively at the fore. I wrote about Janet and her words when we interviewed each other, because it was always a two-way street with Janet, have remained vivid to me. Janet recalled being put in prison in Guam and calling her psychiatrist from jail. He was frantic about my having a depression in prison, not to mention withdrawal, and he was vigorously trying to get antidepressants through the security system for me. It was hysterical. I was hysterical too. When we spoke directly about her depression, she admitted that it had determined so much else. My accomplishments are the whalebones in a corset that allows me to stand up. Without them, I would be only a heap on the floor, she said. Much of the time, I don't know who or what it is that they are supporting, but I know that they are my only protection. I remember her dropping by the house when I said I had been depressed, with bunches of flowers and optimistic lines from favorite poems written in her clear hand. She said that if I wanted her to come sleep on the sofa just so I wouldn't be alone, she'd be glad to do so. It was an astonishing responsiveness. When she wasn't talking about the end of civilization as an exaggeration, she was talking about it as a metaphor. Human beings get through their simple days by way of denial, by not taking fully on board what is too painful to contemplate. Janet was sometimes in denial about her ability to fix the horror around her, but she was never in denial about the horror itself. She was a ray of pure light, forever drawn to and battling back the darkness, and her departure leaves the world permanently dimmed. Let us pay her tribute by fighting with ever greater conviction for the cause of justice that she held so dear and for which she did so much.
I had to bring a prop. I'm Alfred Meyer, and I'm honored to speak to you today as Janet's husband. You've heard so many stories about Janet and why she is so compelling that all of us would be here today to honor her. I have a personal and magical love story to add to this rich tapestry of a life well lived. I hope that it will help mitigate the grief and sorrow we so deeply feel right now. When my older sister Ann introduced me to Janet, she thought that we might find some common ground as activists working to repair and heal the world we live in. Ann was right. We did find much in common, but it went far beyond the Geneva Convention and nuclear waste. We found that for each of us, we were much happier when we were together than when we were apart. After this discovery, I moved to New York City and we decided to get married. When Janet told me that her dear and longtime friend, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, would marry us, I got the message that she was serious about this marriage. Janet and I were blessed with 7 years of loving and living together, sharing friends, traveling, helping each other with work, and providing loving companionship for each other. Through Janet, I learned so much about so many things. How to write a good first sentence for a press release was very helpful for my work, and how to decorate a New York City apartment gave us a warm home to live in. But Janet's core value and driving force, I believe, is one word: love. For our wedding, Janet asked our daughter Kaythee to sing the Louis Armstrong song, "What a Wonderful World." The song says, and I quote, "I see friends shaking hands, saying, 'How do you do?' What they really mean is, 'I love you.'" I think that this is the message that all of us who knew Janet got from her. In her various and creative ways, she said to each of us, "I love you." This was not an idle love. This was a deeply insightful, caring connection and exchange, a very active love. True to Janet's character, merely observing something is not sufficient. Engagement and action always accompanied this love. In fact, Janet had an impatience and creativity that compelled her to action. She didn't want to talk about something, she wanted to do it, and most often did. I describe this as extreme purposefulness. To the very end of her life, she was thinking of others. She was insightfully looking forward in their lives and crafting strategies to solve and resolve circumstances. She had very specific requests for certain people, and she brought deeper understanding to us through these requests. The entire family was dramatically impacted for the better by these communications, which led to cascades of empowerment and actions. Janet's "I love you" was transformed into a particular action for each of us. Janet and I were married in a Jewish huppah, a temporary structure built for our ceremony, to symbolize the sacred space our marriage created for our family. A part of the ceremony includes the breaking of a glass to symbolize the fragility of relationships and life itself. Justice Ginsburg talked about remembering those who are not with us to share our joy, but whose voices we can hear and whose presence we can feel. We think of all those who have loved and who we have loved and still love. We honor the eternalness of our love, and that brings them to this place at this time. And most importantly, Justice Ginsburg continued, our remembrances do not detract from our joy, but rather reinforce it. I am so blessed to have had 7 magical years of life and love with Janet Benshoof. Janet, I love you.
As promised, under 2 hours. Thank you, everyone, for speaking. Mom spent years collecting archives from her personal and professional life. You heard some about that, but it was a very serious thing that she did. She spent countless hours over the past couple of years collecting almost 1,000 photos, old photos of David and I and our families growing up, digitizing them, finding our VHS tapes of our bar mitzvah video and putting it on a DVD, and her and Alfred struggling with the technology until finally giving it to us as our last birthday present, as a printed book and these kind of very hard to read USB drives and DVDs. So I gave it to my tech guy, and we made it right pretty quickly. But everything worked, and it was an amazing compilation of important parts of our life and of Mom's life. And she did the same thing professionally. As some of you know, I own an art gallery with so much unseen material that Mom spent so much of her life and time organizing and collecting. I felt compelled to organize an extraordinary exhibition to honor my mother. My gallery is a 7-minute walk from here, and we'll have cars out front for the short trip in case that's easier or preferred by some of you. The Global Justice Center has been terrific, and various members around here will be calling Ubers or Junos for people who would prefer the short ride than the 7-minute walk. Either way is fine with me. What is important to me is that everyone in this room takes the time to come by the gallery and break bread with us and see what we put together and have a drink and something to eat. We certainly have a full lunch and more in Mom's honor. There are so many things on display there. One of the things, for example, is the very last video known of Mom is on November 1st, at least the last one that I know about. I arrived at my mom's house on November 1st with, and as my girlfriend Susan went to the bathroom, I showed my mom the engagement ring that I bought for Susan. And I had a plan on proposing to her that night at Sushi Yasuda. And I'm not, a romantic. I don't know better. Sushi Yasuda is some of the best sushi in New York. Seems like the perfect place to propose. That's what I thought. And my mom grabbed me and said, and shook me and said, Eli, I beg you, please do it here. Please propose in front of me. It'll be the best thing that ever happened to me. It'll be the best thing ever. You have to do it here. Ask her here. Propose to me. Propose to her in front of me. And really for about a minute, the whole time Susan's in the bathroom, and I'm like, fuck. I have to propose to my girlfriend in front of my mother. And I just didn't even know this is a thing. I mean, do people even do it? But she litigated and forced that issue just as she did everything else in her life, and I simply had no choice. So Alfie secretly, got his camera out to record it. Susan, came out of the bathroom. My mom sat knowing exactly what she had accomplished. Unbelievable how easy the argument was for her, and how Ada was going to be for me. Really, it was not something that I was excited about, but it was something that I did feel was right. It was November 1st. My mom was, look, I've had a father and a mother who met at Harvard Law School. One time or the other, one of them is right. Either my father's right or my mother's right. It was difficult for me to choose. In this case, my father wasn't there, so my mom must have been right. So I proposed to Susan. She knew it was coming. She designed the ring herself. The diamond had to be this big yellow gorgeous diamond, a perfect design that and so on, and I could go on about that, which I won't, but she knew the proposal was coming, but she certainly didn't expect it to happen at Mom's house. So one of the things that you'll see at the gallery, among so many other things, and we have these videos and whatnot, are a small video box that we have of this 2.5-minute proposal that's narrated by my mother. And so I really do. I thank everyone at the Global Justice Center for helping accommodate some transportation for people. We're right over. We're 1 block down and 2 or 3 blocks over. It's a 7-minute walk. Come. It's a big space. You have a card inside each of these that will gain you entry. Although we don't expect to have any problem anyway. That card, if you look closely, Olivia did everything. She just left to go make sure everything's okay at the gallery. And she stole from my Instagram a picture of my mother and me as a gallerist. If you look closely at the fine print on that card, I demanded credit. And she said, Eli, I'm not crediting you on this fucking card. And I said, give me my credit. And so I got what I wanted in this case, and you'll see it says, at the Eli Klein, on that picture that she stole from me of my mom. So on Friday, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote me a letter with supporting documents telling me she believed my mother made a huge impact on her appointment as a justice of the United States Supreme Court by Bill Clinton. I was obviously very moved by that, but now I would like to read you the letter Justice Ginsburg sent to my mom soon after they spoke, a few days before Mom's passing. Justice Ginsburg couldn't speak here today because it has to be in Sundance in Utah for a documentary about her this weekend. So she asked that I read the letter to you all today. Here's Justice Ginsburg's letter to Mom verbatim. Dear Janet, I remember the caring young woman who saw something very wrong in Longchamp's logo and helped to stop it. The leadership, determination, and bravery you brought to the launching of the ACLU's Reproductive Freedom Project, and then your own venture, and the champion of change in Burma and the world over as a founder of the Global Justice Center. Martin Luther King said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it tends toward justice. To make that so, it takes people of your commitment, will, and grit. For the tremendous good you have done in a life worthy of celebration, I love you dearly, Ruth." That's the letter. At that, let's do what Justice Ginsburg said. Come to my gallery for lunch, drinks, and enjoy a celebratory exhibition of my mom's phenomenal, fantastic life. Thank you.